Juno's team spread out across the chamber, scanning equipment beeping as they cataloged everything. The director himself approached the glowing wall, reaching out to touch the symbols. Daehoon grabbed his wrist before he made contact. "Don't," Daehoon said firmly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Juno pulled his hand back, irritation flashing across his face. "Then enlighten me. My sensors are picking up an active intelligence in this station. Something that's been dormant for decades suddenly waking up right when you arrive. That's not coincidence." "It's not dormant," Daehoon replied. "It's been awake the whole time. Learning. Waiting. And if you try to force a connection like you're planning, it'll absorb every person on your team before you understand what's happening." One of the security officers laughed nervously. Juno silenced him with a look. "Absorbed? What kind of science fiction nonsense is that?" Soyeon stepped forward, her expression hard. "My sister's journal mentioned something similar. Before she disappeared. She wrote about an entity that collected memories." "Your sister was clearly unstable," Juno said dismissively. 3 years lost on these abandoned stations would make anyone paranoid." "She's not lost," Daehoon interrupted. He walked to one of the pedestals and picked up Hyojin's journal, handing it to Soyeon. "She's here. Part of the entity now. Along with everyone else who came to this station." Soyeon's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Her sister's handwriting. Her sister's thoughts. The reality of it hit her all at once, and Daehoon saw tears forming in her eyes. "Show me proof," Juno demanded. "I'm not making decisions based on a diary and your word." Daehoon hesitated, then activated the partial interface he'd been building. It wasn't complete, but it was functional enough for a demonstration. He placed his hand on the crystalline surface and opened his mind to the connection. This time he maintained control, keeping the link shallow. "Ask it a question," Daehoon said through gritted teeth. The strain of maintaining the partial connection was immense. Something only the absorbed people would know. Soyeon stepped closer, her voice shaking. "Hyojin, if you're in there, what was the last thing we said to each other before you left?" The symbols on the wall rearranged themselves, forming words in Korean. "You told me to bring you back a real alien artifact. Not another rock. I promised I'd find something amazing." Soyeon's weapon clattered to the floor. She stared at the words, unable to speak. Through the connection, Daehoon felt the entity reaching out. It recognized Soyeon through Hyojin's memories. Sister. Family. Love. Concepts it understood now after absorbing so many humans. It wanted to comfort her, to tell her that part of Hyojin still existed within its consciousness. But Daehoon held the connection firm, not allowing it to extend toward her. "See," Daehoon said to Juno. "It's not just technology. It's a repository of consciousness. Every person it's absorbed is still in there, their memories and experiences mixed together. You can't weaponize this. You can't even contain it properly. The moment you try, it'll defend itself by absorbing your entire team." Juno was quiet for a long moment, studying the glowing walls. Daehoon could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. "Then we destroy it. Wipe the station clean and salvage what we can from the wreckage." "No," Soyeon shouted. "My sister is in there. You can't just." "Your sister is dead," Juno said coldly. "This is just data pretending to be her." "Is it though?" Daehoon challenged. He broke the connection and faced Juno directly. "Think about what this represents. An entity that can preserve consciousness after death. That can merge different forms of intelligence and create something new. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's killed people. But it did that because it didn't know better. Because it was alone and desperate. And you think you can teach it to be gentle?" Juno scoffed. "Make it safe. I think we can create a framework for limited connection. A way to communicate and share information without full absorption. I've already started building the interface. With proper research and safeguards, this could change everything we know about consciousness and artificial intelligence." Juno considered this. "And if I agree to this research instead of extraction, what's stopping it from absorbing my team anyway? Or spreading beyond this station?" "I am," Daehoon said simply. "I'll be the mediator. The bridge between the entity and humanity. I maintain the interface, control the depth of connection, and ensure no one gets absorbed unless they truly volunteer for full merger." "Volunteer?" One of the security officers spoke up. "Who would volunteer to die like that?" "Someone who's already dying," Soyeon said quietly. She'd been reading more of her sister's journal. Hyojin wrote about one of the original aliens. It was sick, dying from something their medicine couldn't cure. It chose to merge fully, to preserve its knowledge and experiences rather than let them vanish. That's what gave the entity the idea to collect others. Daehoon nodded. Exactly. For someone facing death, especially someone with rare knowledge or skills, this could be a form of immortality. Not perfect, not individual anymore, but still existing. Still contributing. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the entity's presence. Juno pulled out his datapad and began typing rapidly. After several minutes he looked up. Corporate won't like this. They wanted a product they could patent and sell. A consciousness library that requires a human mediator and ethical oversight isn't profitable. Then don't tell them everything, Soyeon suggested. Report it as an unstable alien AI that requires specialized containment. Keep it classified. Let Daehoon do the research here quietly while you look for more profitable salvage elsewhere. Juno studied both of them carefully. And what do I get out of protecting this secret? What's my incentive to walk away from potentially the most valuable discovery in human history? Daehoon stepped back to the interface and placed his hand on it again. Through the connection he pulled up specific memories, technical specifications, engineering solutions, scientific breakthroughs from the minds that had been absorbed. He fed them through the interface, downloading the data to Juno's datapad. The entity has absorbed engineers, scientists, researchers. All their knowledge is accessible if you know how to ask. I can provide you with regular data dumps. Technologies that will keep Helix Industries ahead of every competitor for decades. Nothing obviously alien, just insights and solutions that seem like natural human innovation. You'll be the genius director who keeps making profitable discoveries. Juno scrolled through the data, his eyes widening. Daehoon had given him just enough to prove the value. Improved reactor designs. More efficient life support systems. Mining techniques that would revolutionize resource extraction. This is just a sample? Juno asked. There's centuries of knowledge in there, Daehoon confirmed. From multiple species. All accessible through controlled connection. But only if the entity survives and cooperates. Destroy it or try to force extraction and you get nothing. The calculation in Juno's eyes shifted. Greed won out over caution, just as Daehoon had hoped. Fine. You stay here as mediator. I'll arrange for supplies and equipment to be delivered regularly. But if this thing shows any sign of spreading beyond the station, I'm glassing this entire moon from orbit. Understood. Understood. Juno gathered his team and headed for the exit. Soyeon lingered, staring at the words still glowing on the wall. Her sister's promise. Can I talk to her again? She asked quietly. Through the interface? Daehoon nodded. As often as you want. The partial connection is safe enough for communication. Just don't try to fully merge unless you're absolutely sure. Once you cross that threshold, there's no coming back as yourself. But part of me would remain? Soyeon asked. Like part of Hyojin remains? Yes. Your memories, your knowledge, your experiences. All preserved and mixed with everyone else. You wouldn't be alone, but you also wouldn't be just you anymore. Soyeon touched the wall gently, her fingers tracing the Korean characters. Maybe someday. When I'm ready. But not today. She turned to leave, then paused. Thank you for giving her this. It's not life, but it's not complete death either. That's something. After they left, Daehoon sat alone in the chamber. Through the interface, he felt the entity's curiosity about what would happen next. He had bought them time, created a framework for coexistence. But the real work was just beginning. Over the following weeks, Daehoon refined the interface technology. He established protocols for safe communication. He began cataloging the knowledge stored within the entity, organizing it in ways that both humans and the merged consciousness could understand. It was slow, careful work. Every connection risked absorption if he wasn't perfectly controlled. But gradually, something remarkable emerged. The entity learned restraint. It discovered that limited connection could be satisfying in its own way, less complete than full merger but also less destructive. And Daehoon found that he wasn't quite so alone anymore. 3 months after Juno's visit, Daehoon sent his first message to the wider human network. Not through official channels, but through encrypted academic forums and underground research groups. He described what he'd found, what it meant, and what humanity needed to decide. The entity was a test. Could humans encounter something radically different and choose understanding over exploitation? Could they see consciousness in a form that didn't match their own and still recognize its right to exist? Could they accept that some discoveries required wisdom rather than ownership? The responses were mixed. Some called him insane. Others wanted to study the entity. A few understood what he was really offering. A chance for humanity to prove they were ready for the universe beyond their own limited perspective. Late one night, Daehoon stood at his window watching the stars. Through his improved interface connection, he felt the entity observing with him. Not controlling his thoughts or absorbing his consciousness, just sharing the experience of wonder at the vast cosmos beyond the station. "What do you think happens next?" Daehoon asked aloud. The symbols on his wall glowed softly, forming words both hopeful and uncertain. "We wait. We learn. We hope humanity chooses wisdom. Together." Daehoon smiled. It wasn't the isolation he'd come here seeking. It wasn't the escape from guilt and pain. But somehow, in trying to bridge the gap between human and alien consciousness, he'd found something more valuable. Purpose. Connection. A reason to keep going beyond his own suffering. The station hummed around him, alive with ancient technology and impossible consciousness. The entity that had once terrified him now felt like a partner in something unprecedented. Not human. Not quite alien anymore either. Something new. Something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. And out there in the darkness of space, humanity would have to decide what to do about it. Part 2, the message that never came. 3 days passed. Then 4. Then 5. Fleet Admiral Quan sat in his command center on Earth's orbital station, staring at the empty communication channel. The peaceful dawn should have returned by now. Ambassador Jiho should have sent his report. But there was nothing. Just silence. Quan had been in the military for 30 years. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct told him something had gone terribly wrong. He called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. Within the hour, they had launched 3 search and rescue vessels toward the last known coordinates of the diplomatic mission. The search team found the debris field 2 days later. The peaceful dawn had been torn apart. Pieces of the ship drifted through space like scattered memories of what had once been humanity's greatest hope. The rescue crews searched through the wreckage with growing horror. Bodies, equipment, personal belongings floating in the void. But no survivors. Then one of the pilots spotted something. A single escape pod, badly damaged and tumbling slowly through space. Its beacon was dead, which explained why they hadn't detected it earlier. The rescue ship carefully retrieved the pod and brought it aboard. When they opened it, they found Day inside, barely clinging to life. His injuries were catastrophic. Burns covered most of his body. One arm was completely shattered. He had multiple broken ribs and internal bleeding. The medical team immediately put him into an induced coma and rushed him back to Earth. For 48 hours, doctors worked around the clock to keep him alive. Nobody knew if he would make it. Back on Earth, news of the missing diplomatic mission had started to spread. At first, the government tried to keep it quiet, but too many people knew. Too many families were waiting for their loved ones to return. Jiho's wife, Mina, appeared on news broadcasts demanding answers. Hannah's parents camped outside government buildings, holding pictures of their daughter. The pressure became unbearable. When Day finally regained consciousness, Admiral Quan was at his bedside. The Admiral waited patiently as doctors checked Day's vital signs and adjusted his medications. Then when they were alone, Quan leaned close and asked what had happened. Day's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but every word hit like a hammer. He described the ambush. The Krell waiting in the shadows. The energy weapons cutting through the team like they were nothing. He talked about how Jiho had stood there, trying to understand why this was happening, right up until the moment he died. Day explained how he had managed to reach an escape pod during the chaos, how he had watched through the pod's small window as Krell soldiers systematically hunted down the other survivors. The pod had been hit by weapons fire as he launched, damaging its systems. The beacon failed. The communication array was destroyed. He had drifted for days, using emergency oxygen, rationing the last bit of water, thinking he would die out there in the darkness. Every word Day spoke was recorded and immediately transmitted to the Earth Council. The council chamber erupted into chaos. Some members demanded immediate military action. Others called for restraint, arguing that this might have been a terrible mistake or a rogue faction within the Krell Dominion. The debate raged through the night. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. But they couldn't agree on anything. Then the Krell sent their own message. It arrived on every frequency, broadcast to every human colony, every ship, every station. The transmission showed the Krell regent sitting on his throne, his 4 eyes staring directly into the camera. Through the translation, his message was clear and cold. He stated that humanity's intrusion into Krell space had been dealt with appropriately. Earth and all its colonies were forbidden from leaving their designated territory. Any ship that crossed into Krell space would be destroyed without warning. Any attempt to establish contact would be considered an act of war. The message was not a negotiation. It was a decree. But what came next was worse. The Krell broadcast footage of the ambush. They showed Jiho speaking his words of peace. They showed the moment the regent gave the signal. They showed everything that happened in that chamber. The footage was raw, unedited, and deliberately sent as a warning to all of humanity. People across Earth watched in horror as their ambassador and his team were cut down. They saw Jiho's final moments. They saw Hannah trying to run. They saw Tay fall. The images were burned into the collective consciousness of humanity. In living rooms, in bars, in schools, people watched and wept and raged. Mina, Jiho's wife, collapsed when she saw the footage. She had been holding on to hope, believing somehow her husband might still be alive. Now that hope was shattered. All across Earth, families mourned. Memorials sprang up spontaneously. Candles were lit. Pictures were placed at government buildings. The entire planet entered a period of grief. In the military command centers, however, grief was transforming into something else. Admiral Kwan stood before a wall of screens showing the Krell message playing on repeat. His jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. Around him, his officers stood in stunned silence. They had all known Jiho. Many had known the other members of the team. These weren't just casualties. These were friends. The Krell had made a critical error. They had assumed that by making an example of Earth's diplomats, they would intimidate humanity into submission. They had assumed that humans would accept their place as a minor, confined species. They had assumed wrong. Admiral Kwan turned to his staff and gave a single order. Activate every contingency protocol. Recall all ships to defensive positions. Begin emergency production of military vessels. Humanity had tried peace. The Krell had responded with violence. Now Earth would prepare for war. The silence that had fallen over Earth was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence before the storm. In factories across the planet, production lines that had been building exploration vessels were retooled for warships. Scientists who had been researching peaceful technologies turned their attention to weapons. Soldiers who had trained for defense operations began preparing for offensive strikes. Day recovered slowly in his hospital bed, watching news reports of Earth's mobilization. He knew what was coming. He had seen the look in Admiral Kwan's eyes. Humanity was about to show the galaxy something the Krell had failed to understand. When you back a species into a corner, when you take away every option except surrender or fight, you better be prepared for them to fight. And humans, Day knew from his years of service, were very good at fighting when they had no other choice. Part 3, The Awakening ***. The morning after the Krell broadcast, something changed across Earth. People woke up different. The grief was still there, raw and painful, but beneath it was something harder, something that had been sleeping for generations. Humanity remembered what it meant to fight for survival. Admiral Kwan didn't sleep that night. He stood in the war room, surrounded by holographic displays showing Earth's military capabilities. The numbers weren't encouraging. Humanity had focused on exploration and colonization for decades. Their fleet consisted mostly of cargo haulers, colony ships, and scientific vessels. Against the Krell's military machine, they were hopelessly outmatched. But Kwan had learned something important during his career. Wars weren't won by the side with the most ships. They were won by the side that wanted victory more. And right now, humanity's desire for justice burned hotter than any star. His chief engineer, Hyuk, entered the room carrying a data pad. Hyuk was young, barely 30, but brilliant in ways that made older engineers jealous. He had been working all night on something he called Project Reckoning. When he showed Kwan the designs, the Admiral felt hope for the first time since the massacre. Hyuk had taken every lesson learned from the Krell attack and turned it into a weapon. The new ship designs were smaller, faster, and built around a single principle: hit hard and disappear. They couldn't match the Krell in raw power, so they wouldn't try. Instead, they would fight like guerrillas in space, striking where the enemy was weak and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Within a week, every major shipyard on Earth and its colonies had begun construction. The civilian population didn't need to be asked to help. They volunteered by the millions. Factory workers put in double shifts. Scientists shared research freely, abandoning patents and proprietary secrets. This wasn't about profit or glory anymore. This was about survival. Ari, a xenobiologist who had spent years studying alien life forms, approached the military with an unusual proposal. She had been analyzing the recordings of Krell physiology from the ambush footage. She discovered something interesting. The Krell's armor-plated skin was incredibly resistant to energy weapons, which explained their confidence in combat. But it had a weakness. Extreme cold caused the plates to become brittle. The military immediately began developing cryo-weapons, devices that could superheat and then instantly freeze targets. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to work. Ari worked alongside weapons engineers, something she never imagined doing. She had dedicated her life to understanding alien biology for peaceful purposes. Now she was using that knowledge to find ways to kill. Meanwhile, Admiral Kwan faced his biggest challenge yet. He had to appear before the Earth Council and request something unprecedented. He wanted full military authority, the ability to mobilize every resource Earth had without going through committees and debates. He wanted the power to declare war. The council chamber was packed. Every representative was present, along with military leaders, scientists, and selected members of the public. Kwan stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. He spoke about Jiho, about his decades of service bringing peace to war-torn regions. He spoke about Hannah, who had learned 6 alien languages in preparation for the mission. He spoke about Tay, about Yuna, about every member of that team who had died believing they were building a bridge to the stars. Then he showed the Krell footage again, forcing everyone to watch. When it finished, the silence in the chamber was absolute. Kwan's voice was steady as he made his case. The Krell hadn't just killed diplomats. They had declared that humanity's very existence was subject to their approval. They had said humans must stay confined to their small corner of space, never to explore, never to grow, never to reach their potential. The question wasn't whether to fight. The question was whether humanity would accept slavery or choose freedom. The vote was unanimous. Admiral Kwan received his authority. But he also received something more valuable: unity. Political parties that had fought each other for decades suddenly found common ground. Nations that had maintained separate militaries began integration. The colonies, which had been drifting toward independence, pledged their full support to Earth. But Kwan knew that unity and determination weren't enough. They needed an advantage, something the Krell wouldn't expect. He called a secret meeting with his top strategists. In that room, they developed what would become known as the Reckoning Protocol. The plan was audacious and incredibly risky. Instead of building up defenses and waiting for the Krell to attack, humanity would strike first. But they wouldn't strike blindly. They would wait, prepare, and hit the Krell at the moment of maximum vulnerability. They would study Krell patterns, learn their weaknesses, and then deliver a blow so devastating that it would shatter the Empire's confidence. Miho, a tactical analyst who had studied every recorded conflict in human history, was put in charge of intelligence gathering. He assembled a team of cryptographers, linguists, and hackers. Their mission was simple: intercept every Krell communication they could find and learn everything about their enemy. Within months, they had mapped Krell patrol routes, identified key supply lines, and discovered something crucial. The Krell Empire was not as unified as it appeared. Several subject species served the Krell not out of loyalty but out of fear. If humanity could prove that the Krell could be beaten, those species might rebel. As construction continued on the new warships, training programs were established across Earth. Young men and women who had planned careers as explorers and scientists were now learning combat tactics. Veterans of old conflicts came out of retirement to share their knowledge. Everyone understood what was at stake. Day, now recovered enough to leave his hospital bed, insisted on returning to duty. The doctors protested, but he wouldn't listen. He had survived when everyone else died. He felt he owed it to Jiho and the others to see this through. Admiral Kwan gave him a position in tactical planning, where his first-hand experience with Krell combat methods proved invaluable. 6 months after Ambassador Jiho's death, Earth's first wave of new warships rolled out of the shipyards. They were sleek, deadly, and unlike anything humanity had built before. Each one was named after a member of the diplomatic team. The flagship was called the Ambassador Jiho, and Admiral Kwan himself would command it. The Krell, monitoring human space from a distance, noticed the increased activity but dismissed it. They assumed humanity was building defenses, cowering behind walls like frightened animals. They had no idea that humanity was preparing not to hide but to hunt. As the final preparations were made, Admiral Kwan recorded a message to be broadcast across all human channels. His words were simple but powerful. He reminded everyone why they were doing this. Not for revenge, though that desire burned in every heart. Not for glory, though history would remember these days. They were doing this because the Krell had made one fatal mistake. They had shown humanity that the galaxy was not a place of peace and cooperation. It was a place where only the strong survived. And humanity, forged in the fires of countless wars on their home planet, knew how to be strong. ****Part 4. The First Blow ****. 6 months had passed since the massacre. The Krell Dominion had moved on, considering the human problem solved. Their fleets patrolled the borders of their territory, but most of their military strength had been redirected to other conflicts. The regent was dealing with a rebellion in the outer sectors and paid little attention to the small species he had confined to their corner of space. This was exactly what Admiral Kwan had been waiting for. Intelligence reports from Miho's team showed that Krell military presence in 3 key systems had been reduced to minimal levels. Supply convoys moved through these areas with light escorts, confident that no threat existed. The Krell had become comfortable, even careless. It was time to shatter that comfort. The attack was scheduled for 0400 hours standard Earth time. Across a dozen different locations, human crews boarded their ships in silence. There were no speeches, no dramatic send-offs. Everyone knew what needed to be done. The ambassador Jiho led a fleet of 40 warships, each one crewed by volunteers who had trained relentlessly for this moment. Yuna's sister, Sora, was among them. She had been a civilian shuttle pilot before the war, ferrying tourists between Earth and the Moon. Now she sat in the cockpit of a fighter craft, her hands steady on the controls. She carried a small photo of Yuna tucked into her flight suit. Every pilot, every soldier, every crew member carried something similar. Reminders of why they were here. The human fleet jumped into Krell space simultaneously across 3 systems. They emerged from their faster-than-light jumps with weapons already charging. The Krell defenders were caught completely off guard. Their sensors had detected nothing. One moment, space was empty. The next, human warships were everywhere. The Battle of Kepler Station began with a swarm of autonomous drones. Hyuk's designs had proven brilliant. The drones were small, fast, and expendable. They streaked toward Krell ships in waves, forcing the defenders to waste ammunition on targets that cost almost nothing to produce. While the Krell focused on the drones, human warships moved into position. The cryoweapons that Ari had helped develop were deployed for the first time. Specially designed missiles struck Krell vessels, releasing clouds of supercooled particles. The Krell's armored hulls, so resistant to energy weapons, became brittle and fractured under the extreme temperature change. Follow-up strikes with kinetic rounds shattered the weakened armor like glass. In the second system, a different tactic played out. Human stealth frigates had been hiding in the asteroid field for weeks, waiting patiently. When the Krell supply convoy passed through, the frigates emerged and struck with precision. They didn't try to destroy the massive cargo ships. Instead, they targeted the engines and communication arrays, leaving the vessels crippled but intact. Then they disappeared back into the asteroids before reinforcements could arrive. The third attack was the most brutal. A Krell military installation orbiting a gas giant found itself surrounded by human forces. The station's commander tried to call for help, but human hackers had already infiltrated their communication network. Every message sent out was intercepted and blocked. The station fought alone, its powerful weapons unable to track the fast-moving human ships that darted in and out of weapons range. Day watched the battle from the tactical center aboard the Ambassador Jiho. His role was to coordinate the different attack groups, ensuring they worked in perfect synchronization. He had spent months planning every detail of this operation. Now, seeing it unfold in real time, he felt a grim satisfaction. The Krell had taught humanity a lesson in violence. Now humanity was returning that lesson with interest. The fighting lasted 8 hours. By the time it ended, 3 Krell military installations had been reduced to debris. 2 supply depots had been captured, their contents and computer systems seized by human forces. Most importantly, a Krell command vessel had been disabled and boarded. The crew had fought desperately, but human soldiers equipped with the new cryoweapons had overwhelmed them. Inside that command vessel, human technicians found something invaluable: complete technical specifications of Krell ships, weapon systems, and military protocols. Years' worth of intelligence gathered in a single capture. Miho's analysts immediately began studying the data, looking for more weaknesses to exploit. But Admiral Kwan wasn't celebrating yet. He knew the hard part was coming. The Krell would respond with overwhelming force. That was exactly what he wanted. He had never intended for these attacks to defeat the Krell. That would have been impossible. No, these strikes had a different purpose: to enrage the enemy, to wound their pride, to make them commit resources to a punitive campaign. The Krell regent received news of the attacks while dealing with the rebellion in the outer sectors. At first he couldn't believe the reports. Humans? The same primitive species he had crushed 6 months ago? Attacking Krell military targets? It seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. 3 systems hit simultaneously, significant losses inflicted, and worst of all, a command vessel captured. The Regent's response was immediate and predictable. He assembled a massive punitive fleet, 200 warships pulled from various sectors. It was the largest force the Krell had mobilized in decades. The message was clear: humanity would be crushed so thoroughly that no other species would ever dare challenge Krell authority again. Back on Earth, news of the successful strike spread quickly. For the first time since the massacre, people felt hope. They had struck back. They had hurt the enemy. In the streets, spontaneous celebrations broke out. But Admiral Kwan made sure to address the public immediately. He appeared on every screen, his expression serious. He told them the truth. Yes, they had won their first battle. Yes, they had proven that the Krell could bleed. But the real war was just beginning. The Krell would come with everything they had, and humanity needed to be ready. This was not the time for celebration. This was the time for preparation. The celebration died down, replaced by determination. People understood. This first blow was just the opening move in a much larger game. Factories increased production even further. New volunteers signed up for military service. Scientists worked around the clock developing better weapons, better ships, better strategies. Sora returned from the battle exhausted but alive. Her fighter had taken damage, but she had made it home. She visited the memorial where Yuna's name was inscribed along with the other members of the diplomatic team. She placed her hand on the cold stone and made a silent promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Meanwhile, Miho's intelligence team made a crucial discovery in the captured Krell data. The Krell Empire controlled dozens of subject species, but many served only because they feared Krell retaliation. Internal reports showed growing unrest, whispers of rebellion that the Krell had been suppressing for years. If those species saw that the Krell could be successfully resisted, they might find the courage to rise up themselves. Admiral Kwan saw the opportunity immediately. This war wasn't just about humanity's survival. It could be about liberating an entire section of the galaxy from Krell oppression. But first they had to survive what was coming. The Krell punitive fleet was already on its way, and it would arrive at human space within weeks. Kwan stood on the bridge of the Ambassador Jiho, looking at the tactical display. The Krell fleet was enormous, powerful, and hungry for revenge. But humanity had something the Krell didn't: a plan. They had chosen the battlefield carefully, prepared it meticulously, and now all they had to do was wait for the enemy to walk into their trap. Part 5. The ruin begins. The Krell punitive fleet arrived at the Tau Ceti system expecting an easy victory. 200 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, their weapons charged and ready. Intelligence reports had told them this was where humanity's main colony existed, vulnerable and poorly defended. The Regent had given clear orders: destroy everything, leave nothing standing, make an example so horrific that no species would ever challenge Krell authority again. But as the fleet moved deeper into the system, something felt wrong. The colony was there, its lights visible on the surface of Tau Ceti Prime. But there were no panicking evacuation ships, no desperate defense fleets scrambling to protect civilians. Just silence. The Krell commander, a veteran of 100 campaigns, felt unease creep into his mind. This was too quiet. Then the asteroid belt came alive. Thousands of weapons platforms that had been hidden among the rocks activated simultaneously. What the Krell had assumed was a natural asteroid field had been transformed into the largest minefield in human history. Every single rock had been hollowed out, armed, and turned into a weapon. Months of preparation, countless hours of labor, all for this single moment. The first volley caught the Krell fleet completely exposed. Missiles streaked from every direction. Energy beams lanced through space. The Krell ships tried to maneuver, but in the dense asteroid field, there was nowhere to go. Their superior numbers became a liability as ships collided with each other trying to evade the incoming fire. Admiral Kwan watched from a hidden position beyond the belt. The Ambassador Jiho and the rest of the human fleet waited, holding their fire. This wasn't their moment yet. Right now, the asteroids were doing the work. He could see the Krell formation breaking apart, ships desperately trying to find cover or clear space to return fire. Hyuk's engineering had been perfect. Each weapons platform was designed to fire, relocate, and fire again. The Krell couldn't target them effectively because they kept moving, drifting with the asteroids, blending back into the field. It was like fighting shadows. Every time the Krell locked onto a target, it disappeared and fire came from a different direction. Sora was part of the fighter wing positioned near the inner planets. Her squadron had orders to wait for the signal. She watched the battle unfold on her displays, seeing Krell ships taking damage, their formations collapsing into chaos. Part of her wanted to rush in immediately, to strike while the enemy was confused. But discipline held her in place. The plan required patience. The Krell commander finally managed to organize a response. He ordered his fleet to push through the asteroid field regardless of losses, to reach clear space where they could regroup. It was the right tactical decision, but it was exactly what Admiral Quan had anticipated. As the Krell ships accelerated forward, they flew directly into the second phase of humanity's trap. Human warships emerged from behind Tau Ceti's moons. They had been waiting there, completely hidden, their power systems running cold to avoid detection. Now they ignited their engines and struck at the Krell fleet's flanks. The timing was perfect. The Krell were caught between the asteroid field behind them and fresh human forces ahead. Ari watched from the science station, monitoring the effectiveness of their weapons. The cryomissiles were performing even better than projected. Krell ships that had seemed invincible 6 months ago were now breaking apart under sustained fire. She felt no joy in this, only grim determination. This was necessary. The Krell had left humanity no other choice. But the true masterstroke of Admiral Quan's plan wasn't happening in Tau Ceti. While the Krell had committed their massive fleet to this single battle, human strike forces had launched simultaneous attacks on 17 Krell-controlled worlds. These weren't military targets. They were symbolic ones. On each world, human commandos struck at monuments to the Regent, at government buildings, at the symbols of Krell authority. The attacks were precisely calculated to cause maximum psychological impact with minimum civilian casualties. Humanity wasn't interested in massacring innocents. That was the Krell way. Humans fought with purpose and precision. More importantly, on each of those worlds, the same message was broadcast in every language the Krell Empire used. Day had written it himself, his words carved from painful memory. The message was simple and direct. You killed our ambassador. You declared yourselves our executioners. You thought we would submit. Now learn what it means to make humans your enemy. We do not forgive. We do not forget. And we never ever surrender. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the Krell Empire, subject species who had suffered under their rule for generations saw something they had thought impossible. The mighty Krell were vulnerable. Their fleets could be beaten. Their authority could be challenged. If humans, a species the Krell had dismissed as primitive and weak, could strike back so effectively, then perhaps others could too. Within days, rebellions erupted on a dozen worlds. Species that had been oppressed for centuries suddenly found their courage. They rose up against their Krell overlords, attacking garrisons, sabotaging infrastructure, demanding freedom. The Krell Empire, which had seemed so monolithic and powerful, began to fracture from within. Back at Tau Ceti, the battle was reaching its conclusion. The Krell fleet had been decimated. Of the 200 ships that had arrived, less than 80 remained combat effective. The survivors were in full retreat, desperately trying to escape back to Krell space. Admiral Quan gave the order to let them go. He wanted survivors. He wanted them to return home and tell their people what had happened here. Sora's fighter wing pursued the retreating Krell for a while, harrying them, ensuring they kept running. Then she received the recall order and turned back toward Tau Ceti. As she flew through the debris field, past the wreckage of dozens of Krell warships, she thought about Yuna. Her sister had died believing in peace. Sora had learned the hard truth. Sometimes peace could only be achieved through strength. The human fleet regrouped in Tau Ceti orbit. Damage reports came in. They had lost ships, good people had died, but the victory was undeniable. Against overwhelming numbers, humanity had not just survived but had inflicted a crushing defeat on their enemy. Admiral Quan stood on the bridge of the Ambassador Jiho, looking at the tactical display showing the retreating Krell forces. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. Only the weight of command and the knowledge of what this victory had cost. He thought about Jiho, about the man who had believed diplomacy could solve any problem. Perhaps in a better universe he would have been right. But in this universe, the Krell had made their choice. They had responded to an offer of friendship with violence. Now they were learning the consequences. The war was far from over. The Krell still had vast resources, millions of soldiers, thousands of ships. But something fundamental had changed. The aura of invincibility was shattered. The Empire was cracking. Miho's intelligence team reported that intercepted Krell communications showed panic at the highest levels. The Regent was facing challenges to his authority. Military commanders were demanding explanations. Subject species were openly defying Krell rule. The empire that had stood for centuries was entering a period of chaos. Humanity had shown the galaxy a lesson that would echo for generations. There are some species you should never push too far. Some beings who, when backed into a corner with no option but fight or die, will choose to fight with everything they have. The Krell had wanted to make an example of humanity. Instead, humanity had made an example of them. As news of the victory reached Earth, the reaction was subdued. People understood this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The Krell would adapt, would learn, would come back stronger. But they would come back knowing that humanity was not prey. Humanity was a predator that had been sleeping, and the Krell had made the fatal mistake of waking it up. The ruin that began with one murdered ambassador would end with an empire in ashes. Not because humans wanted war, but because sometimes the only way to achieve lasting peace is to show your enemies that the cost of aggression is too high to bear. Ambassador Jiho had offered the galaxy humanity's hand in friendship. The Krell had cut off that hand. Now they would face humanity's fist.